The written being, the being written. The reassuring evidence within which Western tradition had to organize itself and must continue to live would therefore be as follows. The order of the signified is never contemporary, is at best the subtly discrepant inverse or parallel, discrepant by the time of a breath, from the order of the signifier. And the sign must be the unity of a heterogeneity, since the signified, sense or thing, noem or reality, is not in itself a signifier, a trace. In any case, is not constituted in its sense by its relationship with the possible trace. The formal essence of the signified is presence, and the privilege of its proximity to the logos, as fun, is the privilege of presence. This is the inevitable response as soon as one asks, what is the sign? That is to say, when one submits the sign to the question of essence, to the ti esti. The formal essence of the sign can only be determined in terms of presence. One cannot get around that response except by challenging the very form of the question and beginning to think that the sign, crossed out, is that ill-named crossed out thing, the only one that escapes the instituting question of philosophy. What is? Radicalizing the concepts of interpretation, perspective, evaluation, difference, and all the empiricist or non-philosophical motifs that have constantly tormented philosophy throughout the history of the West, and besides have had nothing but the inevitable weakness of being produced in the field of philosophy, Nietzsche, far from remaining simply with Hegel and, as Heidegger wished, within metaphysics, contributed a great deal to the liberation of the signifier from its dependence or derivation with respect to the logos and the related concept of truth, or the primary signified, in whatever sense that is understood. Reading, and therefore writing, the text were for Nietzsche originary operations. I put that word within quotation marks for reasons to appear later. With regard to a sense that they do not first have to transcribe or discover, which would not therefore be a truth signified in the original element and presence of the logos, as topos noetos, divine understanding, or the structure of a priori necessity. To save Nietzsche from a reading of the Heideggerian type, it seems that we must above all not attempt to restore or make explicit a less naive ontology, composed of profound ontological intuitions acceding to some originary truth, an entire fundamentality hidden under the appearance of an empiricist or metaphysical text. The virulence of Nietzschean thought could not be more completely misunderstood. On the contrary, one must accentuate the naivete of a breakthrough which cannot attempt to step outside of metaphysics, which cannot criticize metaphysics radically without still utilizing in a certain way, in a certain type or a certain style of text, propositions that, read within the philosophic corpus, that is to say, according to Nietzsche, ill-read or unread, have always been and will always be naivetes, incoherent signs of an absolute appurtenance. Therefore, rather than protect Nietzsche from the Heideggerian reading, we should perhaps offer him up to it completely, underwriting that interpretation without reserve, in a certain way, and up to the point where, the content of the Nietzschean discourse being almost lost for the question of being, its form regains its absolute strangeness, where his text finally invokes a different type of reading, more faithful to his type of writing. Nietzsche has written what he has written. He has written that writing, and first of all his own, is not originarily subordinate to the logos and to truth, and that this subordination has come into being during an epoch whose meaning we must deconstruct. Now in this direction, but only in this direction, for read otherwise the Nietzschean demolition remains dogmatic and, like all reversals, a captive of that metaphysical edifice which it professes to overthrow. On that point, and in that order of reading, the conclusions of Heidegger and Fink are irrefutable. Heideggerian thought would reinstate rather than destroy the instance of the logos, and of the truth of being as primum signatum, the transcendental signified. Transcendental in a certain sense, as in the Middle Ages, the transcendental, ens unum verum bonum, was said to be the primum cognitum, implied by all categories or all determined significations, by all lexicons and all syntax, and therefore by all linguistic signifiers, though not to be identified simply with any one of those signifiers, allowing itself to be pre-comprehended through each of them, remaining irreducible to all the epochal determinations that it nonetheless makes possible, thus opening the history of the Logos, yet itself being only through the Logos, that is, being nothing before the Logos and outside of it. The Logos of being, thought obeying the voice of being, is the first and the last resource of the sign, of the difference between signans and signatum. There has to be a transcendental signified for the difference between signifier and signified to be somewhere absolute and irreducible. It is not by chance that the thought of being, as the thought of this transcendental signified, is manifested above all in the voice, in a language of words, mots. The voice is heard, understood. That undoubtedly is what is called conscience, closest to the self as the absolute effacement of the signifier, pure auto-affection that necessarily has the form of time and which does not borrow from outside of itself, in the world or in reality, any accessory signifier, any substance of expression foreign to its own spontaneity. It is the unique experience of the signified producing itself spontaneously from within the self, and nevertheless as signified concept, in the element of ideality or universality. The unworldly character of this substance of expression is constitutive of this ideality. This experience of the effacement of the signifier in the voice is not merely one illusion among many, since it is the condition of the very idea of truth, but I shall elsewhere show in what it does delude itself. This illusion is the history of truth, and it cannot be dissipated so quickly. Within the closure of this experience, the word, mot, is lived as the elementary and undecomposable unity of the signified and the voice, of the concept and a transparent substance of expression. This experience is considered in its greatest purity, and at the same time in the condition of its possibility, as the experience of being. The word being, or at any rate the words designating the sense of being in different languages, is, with some others, an originary word, urvort, the transcendental word assuring the possibility of being word to all other words. As such, it is pre-comprehended in all language, and, this is the opening of being in time, only this pre-comprehension would permit the opening of the question of the sense of being in general, beyond all regional ontologies and all metaphysics, a question that broaches philosophy, for example in The Sophist, and lets itself be taken over by philosophy, a question that Heidegger repeats by submitting the history of metaphysics to it. Heidegger reminds us constantly that the sense of being is neither the word being, nor the concept of being, but as that sense is nothing outside of language, and the language of words, it is tied, if not to a particular word or to a particular system of language, concesso non dato, at least to the possibility of the word in general, and to the possibility of its irreducible simplicity. One could thus think that it remains only to choose between two possibilities. 1. Does a modern linguistics, a science of signification, breaking the unity of the word, and breaking with its alleged irreducibility, still have anything to do with language? Heidegger would probably doubt it. 2. Conversely, is not all that is profoundly meditated as the thought or the question of being enclosed within an old linguistics of the word which one practices here unknowingly? Unknowingly, because such a linguistics, whether spontaneous or systematic, has always had to share the presuppositions of metaphysics. The two operate on the same grounds. It goes without saying that the alternatives cannot be so simple. On the one hand, if modern linguistics remains completely enclosed within a classical conceptuality, if especially it naively uses the word being and all that it presupposes, that which, within this linguistics, deconstructs the unity of the word in general can no longer, according to the model of the Heideggerian question, as it functions powerfully from the very opening of being and time, be circumscribed as ontic science or regional ontology. Inasmuch as the question of being unites indissolubly with the pre-comprehension of the word being, without being reduced to it, the linguistics that works for the deconstruction of the constituted unity of that word has only, in fact or in principle, to have the question of being posed in order to define its field and the order of its dependence. Not only is its field no longer simply ontic, but the limits of ontology that correspond to it no longer have anything regional about them. And can what I say here of linguistics, or at least of a certain work that may be undertaken within it, and thanks to it, not be said of all research, inasmuch as, and to the strict extent that, it would finally deconstitute the founding concept words of ontology, of being in its privilege? Outside of linguistics, it is in psychoanalytic research that this breakthrough seems at present to have the greatest likelihood of being expanded. Within the strictly limited space of this breakthrough, these sciences are no longer dominated by the questions of a transcendental phenomenology or a fundamental ontology. One may perhaps say, following the order of questions inaugurated by being in time, and radicalizing the questions of Husserlian phenomenology, that this breakthrough does not belong to science itself, that what thus seems to be produced within an ontic field or within a regional ontology does not belong to them by right and leads back to the question of being itself. Because it is indeed the question of being that Heidegger asks metaphysics, and with it the question of truth, of sense, of the logos. The incessant meditation upon that question does not restore confidence. On the contrary, it dislodges the confidence at its own depth, which, being a matter of the meaning of being, is more difficult than is often believed. In examining the state just before all determinations of being, destroying the securities of ontotheology, such a meditation contributes, quite as much as the most contemporary linguistics, to the dislocation of the unity of the sense of being, that is, in the last instance, the unity of the word. It is thus that, after evoking the voice of being, Heidegger recalls that it is silent, mute, insonorous, wordless, originarily aphonic, die Gewahr der lautlosen Stimme verborgener Quellen. The voice of the sources is not heard. A rupture between the originary meaning of being and the word, between meaning and the voice of being and the fun, between the call of being and articulated sound. Such a rupture, which at once confirms a fundamental metaphor and renders it suspect by accentuating its metaphoric discrepancy, translates the ambiguity of the Heideggerian situation with respect to the metaphysics of presence and logocentrism. It is at once contained within it and transgresses it, but it is impossible to separate the two. The very movement of transgression sometimes holds it back short of the limit. In opposition to what we suggested above, it must be remembered that for Heidegger, the sense of being is never simply and rigorously assignified. It is not by chance that that word is not used. That means that being escapes the movement of the sign, a proposition that can equally well be understood as a repetition of the classical tradition and as a caution with respect to a technical or metaphysical theory of signification. On the other hand, the sense of being is literally neither primary nor fundamental, nor transcendental, whether understood in this scholastic, Kantian, or Husserlian sense. The restoration of being as transcending the categories of the entity, the opening of the fundamental ontology, are nothing but necessary, yet provisional moments. From the introduction to metaphysics onward, Heidegger renounces the project of, and the word, ontology. The necessary, originary, and irreducible dissimulation of the meaning of being, its occultation within the very blossoming forth of presence, that retreat without which there would be no history of being, which was completely history and history of being, Heidegger's insistence on noting that being is produced as history only through the logos, and is nothing outside of it, the difference between being and the entity, all this clearly indicates that fundamentally nothing escapes the movement of the signifier, and that, in the last instance, the difference between signified and signifier is nothing. This proposition of transgression, not yet integrated into a careful discourse, runs the risk of formulating regression itself. One must therefore go by way of the question of being, as it is directed by Heidegger and by him alone, at and beyond ontotheology, in order to reach the rigorous thought of that strange non-difference, and in order to determine it correctly. Heidegger occasionally reminds us that being, as it is fixed in its general syntactic and lexicological forms within linguistics and Western philosophy, is not a primary and absolutely irreducible signified, that it is still rooted in a system of languages and an historically determined significance, although strangely privileged as the virtue of disclosure and assimilation, particularly when he invites us to meditate on the privilege of the third-person singular of the present indicative and the infinitive. Western metaphysics, as the limitation of the sense of being within the field of presence, is produced as the domination of a linguistic form. To question the origin of that domination does not amount to hypostatizing a transcendental signified, but to a questioning of what constitutes our history and what produced transcendentality itself. Heidegger brings it up also when in Zur Seinsfrage, for the same reason. He lets the word being be read only if it is crossed out, kreuzweise Durchstreichung. That mark of deletion is not, however, a merely negative symbol. That deletion is the final writing of an epoch. Under its strokes, the presence of a transcendental signified is effaced while still remaining legible. Is effaced while still remaining legible. Is destroyed while making visible the very idea of the sign. Inasmuch as it delimits ontotheology, the metaphysics of presence and logocentrism, this last writing is also the first writing. To come to recognize, not within but on the horizon of the Heideggerian paths, and yet in them, that the sense of being is not a transcendental or trans-epochal signified, even if it was always dissimulated within the epoch, but already, in a truly unheard-of sense, a determined signifying trace, is to affirm that within the decisive concept of ontico-ontological difference, all is not to be thought at one go. Entity and being, ontic and ontological, ontico-ontological are, in an original style, derivative with regard to difference, and with respect to what I shall later call différance, an economic concept designating the production of differing/deferring. The ontico-ontological difference and its ground, Grund, in the transcendence of Dasein, vom Wesen des Grundes, are not absolutely originary. Différance by itself would be more originary, but one would no longer be able to call it origin or ground, those notions belonging, essentially, to the history of ontotheology, to the system functioning as the effacing of difference. It can, however, be thought of in the closest proximity to itself only on one condition, that one begins by determining it as the ontico-ontological difference before erasing that determination. The necessity of passing through that erased determination, the necessity of that trick of writing, is irreducible, an unemphatic and difficult thought that, through much unperceived mediation, must carry the entire burden of our question, a question that I shall provisionally call historial. It is with its help that I shall later be able to attempt to relate différance and writing. The hesitation of these thoughts, here Nietzsche's and Heidegger's, is not an incoherence. It is a trembling proper to all post-Hegelian attempts and to this passage between two epochs. The movements of deconstruction do not destroy structures from the outside. They are not possible and effective, nor can they take accurate aim, except by inhabiting those structures, inhabiting them in a certain way, because one always inhabits, and all the more when one does not suspect it. Operating necessarily from the inside, borrowing all the strategic and economic resources of subversion from the old structure, borrowing them structurally, that is to say, without being able to isolate their elements and atoms, the enterprise of deconstruction always in a certain way falls prey to its own work. This is what the person who has begun the same work in another area of the same habitation does not fail to point out with zeal. No exercise is more widespread today, and one should be able to formalize its rules. Hegel was already caught up in this game. On the one hand, he undoubtedly summed up the entire philosophy of the Logos. He determined ontology as absolute logic. He assembled all the delimitations of philosophy as presence. He assigned to presence the eschatology of parousia, of the self-proximity of infinite subjectivity. And for the same reason, he had to debase or subordinate writing. When he criticizes the Leibnizian characteristic, the formalism of the understanding, and mathematical symbolism, he makes the same gesture, denouncing the being outside of itself of the logos in the sensible or the intellectual abstraction. Writing is that forgetting of the self, that exteriorization, the contrary of the interiorizing memory, of the Erinnerung that opens the history of the spirit. It is this that the Phaedrus said. Writing is at once mnemotechnique and the power of forgetting. Naturally, the Hegelian critique of writing stops at the alphabet. As phonetic writing, the alphabet is at the same time more servile, more contemptible, more secondary. Alphabetic writing expresses sounds which are themselves signs. It consists, therefore, of the signs of signs. Aus Zeichen der Zeichen, Enzyklopädie, section 459. But it is also the best writing, the mind's writing. Its effacement before the voice, that in it which respects the ideal interiority of phonics signifies, all that by which it sublimates space and sight, all that makes of it the writing of history, the writing, that is, of the infinite spirit relating to itself in its discourse and its culture. It follows that to learn to read and write an alphabetic writing should be regarded as a means to infinite culture, unendliches Bildungsmittel, that is not enough appreciated, because thus the mind, distancing itself from the concrete sense perceptible, directs its attention on the more formal moment, the sonorous word and its abstract elements, and contributes essentially to the founding and purifying of the ground of interiority within the subject. In that sense, it is the Aufhebung of other writings, particularly of hieroglyphic script and of the Leibnizian characteristic that had been criticized previously through one and the same gesture. Aufhebung is, more or less implicitly, the dominant concept of nearly all histories of writing, even today. It is the concept of history and of teleology. In fact, Hegel continues, acquired habit later also suppresses the specificity of alphabetic writing, which consists in seeming to be, in the interest of sight, a detour, Umweg, through hearing to arrive at representations, and makes it into hieroglyphic script for us, such that in using it we do not need to have present to our consciousness the mediation of sounds. It is on this condition that Hegel subscribes to the Leibnizian praise of non-phonetic writing. It can be produced by deaf mutes, Leibniz had said. Hegel, beside the fact that by the practice which transforms this alphabetic script into hieroglyphics, the aptitude for abstraction acquired through such an exercise is conserved, italics added, the reading of hieroglyphs is for itself a deaf reading and a mute writing. What is audible or temporal, visible or spatial, has each its proper basis, and in the first place they are of equal value. But in alphabetic script there is only one basis, and that following a specific relation, namely that the visible language is related only as a sign to the audible language. Intelligence expresses itself immediately and unconditionally through speech. What writing itself, in its non-phonetic moment, betrays is life. It menaces at once the breath, the spirit, and history as the spirit's relationship with itself. It is their end, their finitude, their paralysis, cutting breath short, sterilizing or immobilizing spiritual creation in the repetition of the letter, in the commentary or the exegesis, confined in a narrow space, reserved for a minority. It is the principle of death and of difference in the becoming of being. It is to speech what China is to Europe. It is only to the exegeticism of Chinese spiritual culture that their hieroglyphic writing is suited. This type of writing is, besides, the part reserved for a very small section of the people, the section that possesses the exclusive domain of spiritual culture. A hieroglyphic script would require a philosophy as exegetical as Chinese culture generally is. If the non-phonetic moment menaces the history and the life of the spirit as self-presence in the breath, it is because it menaces substantiality, that other metaphysical name of presence and of ousia, first in the form of the substantive. Non-phonetic writing breaks the noun apart. It describes relations and not appellations. The noun and the word, those unities of breath and concept, are effaced within pure writing. In that regard, Leibniz is as disturbing as the Chinese in Europe. This situation, the analytic notation of representations in hieroglyphic script, which seduced Leibniz to the point of wrongly preferring this script to the alphabetic, rather contradicts the fundamental exigency of language in general, namely the noun. All difference, Abweichung, in analysis, would produce another formation of the written substantive. The horizon of absolute knowledge is the effacement of writing in the logos, the retrieval of the trace in parousia, the reappropriation of difference, the accomplishment of what I have elsewhere called the metaphysics of the proper. Translator's note, le propre, self-possession, propriety, property, cleanliness. Yet all that Hegel thought within this horizon, all that is except eschatology, may be reread as a meditation on writing. Hegel is also the thinker of irreducible difference. He rehabilitated thought as the memory productive of signs, and he reintroduced, as I shall try to show elsewhere, the essential necessity of the written trace in a philosophical, that is to say, Socratic discourse, that had always believed it possible to do without it, the last philosopher of the book, and the first thinker of writing.